So this is the interior of a Centurion 24 without the safe lighting kit installed, and just overhead lighting like you'd find in any typical household room. So you can see there's a lot of shadows, a lot of darkness. You can see the guns that are out at the edge, but anything to be up on the upper shelves you really can't see. The identical safe with identical lighting conditions, kit installed and powered up. And you can see how bright it is inside the safe. You can clearly see everything, even back in the dark recesses and dark corners. And that's when it switches back off. I've got on the table the tools that I'm going to use to do this, and I've got 4 different types of pliers looking things. I've got a linesman's pliers. I'm going to use this to cut the upholstery pins down. I've got a nippy cutters. I'm going to use this for cutting the various wires as we do the connections. I've got a combination stripper cutter, and if you've got one of these, it does have a cutter in it and you can use it. It's just not as convenient as the nippy cutters. And then I've got another needle nose pliers with a cutter in it. I'll use this to hold different things and may use the cutter on it. If you don't have this diversity of plier type devices, you can consolidate down. You can actually strip wires with one of these, and you can even cut the upholstery pins with something like this. It's just going to be a little harder and it will wear the jaws a little bit, whereas something like this is going to have no problem with it. You're going to need solder, and it's electronic solder. Make sure that you don't get plumbing solder, and you want it to be fairly thin. Now, plumbing solder tends to have an acid core, which will not end well. You want to make sure it's electronic solder. Anything that you can get at Amazon. The tools you can get at Lowe's, Home Depot, or your hardware store of choice. And a soldering iron. And I happen to like these butane-powered soldering irons. Used to get them at Radio Shack. They don't exist anymore, but now you can get them on Amazon. They're convenient because they don't have cords. They're ready to go right away. They get good and hot, and they also are really good for doing heat shrink tubing. You kind of wave it over the tubing, and it'll shrink heat shrink tubing. And I happen to have a glue gun, so I'm going to use it. If you don't have a glue gun, you can use adhesives. And you'll see when we go to build the battery boxes that we're going to use the glue gun to hold the wires in place, attach the fuse holder to it, and also cover up any exposed metal pins to avoid short circuits. Now, if you choose not to use the battery box, then you can skip that because you won't be worrying about the batteries. If you're going to buy an AC adapter, if you've got AC in your safe. The only thing I'll caution you, if you don't want to use a glue gun, you can use various different adhesives. Don't use any kind of RTV, otherwise known as silicone sealer. The way that stuff works is it picks up ambient moisture and produces acetic acid, basically vinegar. Acid is not something you want floating around in your safe. And that's one advantage of the glue gun, the hot glue, is there's no chemical reaction here. It gets hot, turns into a liquid. When it cools, it sets up. So that makes this a really good choice for putting inside of a safe. Other than that, there's really not very many tools needed. I've got all the electrical parts that are going to be needed, well, and some mechanical parts that are going to be needed to do this. Some of these parts, like if you choose to use a wall wart type power supply, if you've got 110 volt in your safe, like an outlet, then you're not going to need the battery related stuff. But if you're going to use batteries, you'll need a battery box. You'll note this one holds 10 AA's. That's because I'm going to use nickel metal hydrides. If you're going to use alkalines, then you'd want to get one that holds 8 AA's. But that'll be an expensive habit to feed. You'll need some assorted shrink wrap, and you can get these in like a bulk pack fairly inexpensively. You'll need a fuse holder. And as far as fuses go, by the way, the days of batteries being harmless, when it was alkaline batteries, they were fairly harmless. Nickel metal hydrides actually have enough energy density and a low enough internal resistance, they can actually source enough current during a short to actually cause a problem. You'll need some power connectors. 2.1 millimeter is the common size, and this is also the size that's commonly used in CCTV, closed circuit TV, so they're very readily available. A passive infrared receiver, this one's a Sensky. Obviously the LED lighting. This one is white, and I'm using 3528, and the color temperature on this is around 5600, so it's going to be bright white. Watch out for doing things like blue or green or yellow. It'll kind of make your safe inside kind of look dull. And then these upholstery pins. Now, the upholstery pins you may or may not use depending on your safe, but these are to go into the fireboard and keep the LED strip from wiggling around. You'll need a fuse, the smallest possible fuse that will carry the current. For the size that I'm going to build, a 2-amp fuse is good. And these little wire clips. And these are for holding it along the top. And what this will do, oh, and some Velcro, don't forget the Velcro. What this will do is give you the ability to not only make the kit, but also install it. One other note, as far as the batteries go, it's much cheaper to use rechargeables, nickel metal hydrides. I use these Amazon Basics high capacity. There's also a standard capacity, and there's also a brand called AnyLoop. Get a good quality one, and they'll last a long time. And these will give you the ability to run this for actually over a month before having to swap out the batteries. And what I do is I build one more battery box than I have light kits. So I can have one that's already charged and ready to go, and you just swap out the battery boxes. And that's what these connectors allow you to do, is to unplug and plug in a battery box. So you can have the batteries fully charged, waiting. When one needs to be swapped out, you swap out the batteries, and you're back up and running, and then you have all the time in the world to charge the batteries back up. Now again, you can use alkalines, you buy an 8-pack, or you can use a wall wart 12-volt DC type power supply if you have AC power in the safe. One thing I want to point out about the LED strips that I'm using, these are waterproof. Not that they're really super waterproof or that I'm expecting water in the safe, but instead of having the surface of the chips exposed, it puts kind of a rubberized layer over it. And that kind of helps with if something brushes up against it, it's not going to create a short circuit or damage the circuit. These are 3528 LEDs, and you'll notice that there's 4 little dots, 4 little dots. They're 2 inches apart. They're exactly 2 inches apart. That's where you can cut. You can't cut in the middle. You can only cut between 2 of these dots, and they're actually copper pads for connecting wiring to. You can also chain 2 of them together. There's little clips you can get. They don't tend to work well with the waterproof, so I'll just use some of the extra wire if I need to put one together. But these come in 16.4 feet rolls. It happens to be 5 meters. And the way you would measure the safe is measure the door. The easiest way to do it is measure the door. Measure the height and width of the door. Generally, I don't put any lights on the bottom because you're going to put stuff down there like magazines and stuff like that, and you don't want it smacking into the lighting. So you take the height of the door times 2 and the top of the door across times 1, and that gets you pretty close to what you're going to need. And keep in mind, you don't have to go all the way down to the bottom. In fact, you almost really don't want it just laying on the bottom, so a couple inches short, you're still going to have plenty of light. So for the safe I'm going to make this one for, the door is 54 inches tall and 24 inches wide. So I'll end up measuring out to make that up, and that'll be the length that I'll cut and then start wiring on. So I'm going to start with making the battery boxes, and again, you can go back and figure out how far to skip if you're not going to do batteries. First thing I'm going to do, I've got the glue gun hot. The first thing I'm going to do is take and put a little bit of hot glue on every one of these metal eyelets. What I want to do is basically insulate them. And what I'm trying to make sure of is if they touch a metal part of the safe, that I'm not going to get a short circuit. Because again, just because these are batteries doesn't mean they're harmless. So I'm just kind of going to go right along and do that. And then I'll pause it, I'll get that done, and I'll resume. I'm going to make sure that try to keep this as quick as possible because it's probably going to be a long video one way or the other. Once the glue cooled, by the way, you'll get little stringers between each one of these. Let the glue cool before you try to remove them or it'll just pull. Once it cools, you can just kind of remove those. And I've now taken and I put the fuse holder together, and I'm going to put the fuse holder right here. So I've pre-stripped and cut the wires. So all I do is take the glue gun again, put a little bit of glue down, and then press the fuse holder into it. Now keep in mind that glue is hot. The whole word hot glue. You really don't want it on your fingers. It does take a second to cool. It doesn't have to cure like an epoxy or anything else, but while it's still hot, it's still liquid. Once it cools, then it'll set. So, hold it together for a few minutes, let it cool, and then you can go to the next step. And you will notice that the glue gun is going to ooze a little bit, and that's just natural for a glue gun, which is why I've got it on this old pizza pan. It doesn't really matter what happens, and I'll be able to flick the glue off. Gone ahead and made the connection, and I'll show you soldering a couple of the other connections, but I'm not going to make you sit and watch me do each one. So I've gone ahead and made the connection, and I had to keep cooling this shrink wrap tubing, but now I'm going to bring the tubing down, and I'm going to bring it over and completely cover the joint. And then I'm going to turn this on high, and basically trying to keep it from touching it, but I'm just going to wave it around, and I'm going to go back and forth, and then I'm going to go around it. Now you can also use a heat gun, but it's real easy to burn your fingers with a heat gun in close proximity, and this will work quite well to do it. So I'm just going to wave this back and forth, but whether you choose to use this or a heat gun or any other type of, a small flame torch, whatever you're wanting to do, what you're really wanting to do is just set that heat shrink tubing down around here. And once you've done that and you've gotten it all shrunk down, which I went ahead and did, then just get it to lay flat, put a little ball of the glue on that and the negative wire. I'm wanting to put the two wires together and protect the two. Let that cool for a second. I moved too soon. Let that cool, and then you can also pin the positive and negative down up here, and then we'll go ahead and make the rest of the connections. You can see what I've done here. I've got it set up and I've got one of the joints assembled, but it's not soldered yet. I have heat shrink tubing on each of the wires, and then I've got a bigger piece of heat shrink tubing here. What I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to make the connections, slide this heat shrink over each individual connection and heat shrink it. Then I'm going to slide the bigger one over the two connections. The other thing you'll notice is they're kind of offset. You see that the wire for the negative is longer on the battery box and shorter on the connector than the positive. And that's on purpose. It's going to offset the two soldered connections. So if you happen to get a wire poked through the heat shrink, which is unlikely, but if it happens to occur, it's going to be up against insulation. I'm going to do what's called an inline joint. There's two ways to connect two wires. The easiest way that most people are used to is you put the two wires side by side and then you twist them. And what you end up with is a big bulge there. With an inline, it's a little more difficult to do. It takes a little bit more skill. But you lay the wires on top of each other like this and you twist them like this. So you end up with, and you spend a little bit of time, you end up with all the wires twined together. This is a very weak joint. It would be very easy right now if I were to just tug on it, it'll come right apart. But once it's soldered, it's a very strong joint. And the advantage to that is the joint itself is really no thicker than the wire. So I'm going to do mostly inline joints throughout here, but if you find yourself unable to do that, then you can do the typical lay them side by side, twist them, solder them, and then lay one wire over on top of the other. And you'll have a thicker joint, a little bit bulkier, but it'll still work. I'm going to go ahead and solder this one, and I'll get my soldering iron hot, and I'll show you this one joint that I'll solder, and then after that I'm not going to make you suffer through all the soldering. As far as techniques to solder, there's a number of different techniques. The big thing you want to avoid is a cold solder joint, which means that the solder is really sitting on top of the joint instead of down inside of it. The way I always do that is I put the soldering iron underneath the joint, and I'll touch the iron once or twice just to get some liquid solder up into the joint. But then after that, I wait till the joint itself is actually hot enough to pull the solder. So I'm touching the iron now you see I'm just touching just the joint, and it pulled the solder. So at this point, the solder actually wicked all the way through that joint, and it'll be a nice strong joint when it cools off. Once it cools, I'm going to do the other one, and then I'll bring the shrink wrap down, and just like I showed you before, I'll use the soldering iron to shrink it, and then we will be ready to go with the battery box. I've got a finished battery box here. It's not super pretty. You can see the glue and stuff like that, but again, this is to protect the connections from shorting out. You see the fuse holders here with a fuse in it. And one important note is polarity. The power supply should be a male. You'll have some stringers from the glue. The power supply should be a male. The load is a female. So if you make any connections, you want to make sure that if you like to make an extender, which is one of the things we're going to end up doing, that you have both a male and a female. The positive should be the tip. If you just follow the color coding of these, the majority of these are color coded. Red is positive, black is negative. And if you just follow the color coding, you're going to be good. And you'll see that there's shrink wrap on all the connections, so there's no connections that are exposed that can short out, and there's no electrical tape on this to get gooey, fall off, slide. The last thing that we'll end up doing is going to put a little piece of Velcro on the bottom, and we're going to put a piece of Velcro across here. What you want to do is you don't want to hang this on the wall. You don't want the weight hanging on the felt. So you want to set it on the floor of the safe and push it up against the wall on the same side as the connections. So the weight of the battery just sits on the safe floor, and all the Velcro does is keep it from tipping over. So you just need a little bit of Velcro to keep it upright and to keep the bottom from kicking out if you happen to brush it. To remove it, you kind of put your hand on the felt behind it, pull it loose and pick it up. To put a new one in, you kind of put it in like this and drop it into place and it sticks. And the Velcro, again, is just kind of holding it in place. It's not necessarily supporting the weight of it. I'm going to make an extender, which you'll need if you have the battery box, because you want to put the infrared sensor up a little bit higher, up by where your hands are. And the battery box's cable, depending on the length of the ones you bought, may not be long enough. For this particular installation where I want to put the sensor, I need about a 24-inch extension, which happens to be about 2 of these, because these are 12 inches each. Easiest way to do that offset thing I showed you is, so I've got them all lined up, I've got them negative to negative and positive to positive, but I want one to be longer than the other. So just turn it around. Go positive to negative, negative to positive, and about the length of the joint, cut one pair. So I've got a negative and positive together, and I cut it. Now when I turn it around, I'll see that I've got a negative and a positive that are going to line up right. When I strip them, I'll be able to do my inline connections. So same game, I'm going to strip the wires, slide smaller heat shrink tubing on it, twine them together, solder them, and then bring the bigger heat shrink tubing down. And what I'll end up with is a little extension cable that goes like that, that'll extend from the battery box to the infrared. And by the way, make sure you use a male-female pair, because you're going to have the female that's going to connect to the battery box, and then the male that's going to go to the infrared device. I'm going to measure off 132 inches. That's the 2 sides of the door plus the top. And I'm not going to count the pigtail, so I'm going to start at the base of the LEDs. And I'm just going to use this fabric cutting board. You get these things at Joann Fabric. They're polyethylene, and they're real strong, and they're really perfect for this type of stuff. They're chemical resistant and really, really durable. So I got 75, 100, 125, and then I need 7 inches. And I need to go to a break point, so I'm going to go a little over 7 inches, because I need to cut it at these connector points that I mentioned before. And I want to be careful to cut it fairly close to the line so that I can reuse this second section if I want to. So now I've got my 132 inches. I'm going to put a little piece of heat shrink tape on this end. I'm going to put the connector on the other end, and we'll be ready to rock and roll. A few tips on soldering on the actual LED strip itself. First off, I cut off some of the silicone that protects it, the waterproofing, and you'll see that there's a little copper pad there. That one is the positive, and this one's not so coppery. That one is because I actually put a little drop of solder on it, so I pre-tinned it. You want to have a nice clean hot iron, touch it, put some solder on it, and it creates a little solder ball. I'm going to do that for this one. That's it. So now I've got 2 little solder balls on there. That's going to make it easier when I actually go to connect the wires. And that's going to make it much easier for the last step, which is of course to connect them to the LED strip itself. The last step is to actually connect the two. And because I've pre-soldered the wires and pre-soldered the little pads, I've got solder to work with. I shouldn't need to bring more additional solder in from the spool. So I just pin them down and heat them till the solder absorbs. Then I do the other one. Now I'm not quite finished at this point. I do want to bring a little bit of fresh solder in so I don't get a cold solder joint, but at least now this is kind of the equivalent of tack welding. So I'm going to pin them back down again and bring in just a little bit of fresh solder. And I'm going to do that for each one of them. Hold them till they cool. And if I did everything right, I should be able to light this strip up. And before I actually go ahead and do all the shrink wrap and everything else, I am actually going to test it. So I'm going to lift it off, make sure the solder's out of the way, lift it off so it's not anything metal, and hook it up to the battery pack. And it lights. So it's not super difficult, there's just a few tricks. Well, I've got one ready to go. Of course, it looks like a hot mess sitting on the table because it's just a kind of big long snake. But I've got my battery box with the Velcro on the ends. You see it here, it's the hook part, the non-fuzzy part of the Velcro, because that's going to catch on the felt in the safe. I've got several of these cut down to about this length, so I've got them cut down to a little over 1 inch. That'll vary depending on your safe. I've got a number of the little clips for connecting it across the top, and basically, and I'll show you one installed, but across the top of the safe I'm going to go right along the metal edge with these clips, and along the sides of the safe, because that's where the locking bars on this particular safe goes, I'm going to go over towards the edge into the fireboard so I can avoid the locking plates. And then there's the infrared receiver, and of course the light strip itself. And one thing I'll also note, on the cut end, I put a piece of shrink wrap to protect the cut end. And I'm going to go ahead and light it up, but what it'll do is it'll kind of screw up the white balance, but at least you'll see. But if I reach in and touch that or bother that light sensor, it will turn on the strip. And then after an appropriate period of time, it'll turn itself back off. Most of these are adjustable. This one is. I'm probably going to adjust it for a little bit longer interval. That'll depend on which one you get, and you'll just have to use the instructions that come with it. So for about $75 to build one kit, a little less for every subsequent kit you build because a lot of that stuff comes in a multi-pack, what you get is a fully automatic lighting system in your safe that when you open it and it detects you, lights up. Once I close this safe, after whatever time interval I've set, it'll shut itself off and use very little battery power. Beyond that, if you like our videos, please give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe, check us out on Facebook, Patreon, Instagram, Twitter, kind of everywhere. Thank you.